What's up guys, Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So in today's video we're going to talk about everything you need to know to get started with joint push-pull, the best tool for push-pulling curved and complex surfaces in SketchUp. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. And so you can get joint push-pull from Sketchucation. I will link to this in the notes down below. Now note that we're looking for joint push-pull interactive by Fredo 6. So a couple things about this tool. First off, this is a paid extension now. So you can either download this just individually, or you can also download it as a part of Fredo 6's bundle, which is usually what I recommend because the bundle gives you access to not only joint push-pull, which is great for push-pulling curved surfaces, but his other tool sets like Curveloft, Topo Shaper, tools on surface, which allows you to draw on complex surfaces, that kind of thing. So if you can, it's a one-time payment to download all of those. That's usually what I recommend, but you can download this one as well. Okay, and so what joint push-pull is it's a tool for push-pulling curved surfaces. Really, when you dive into it, it's kind of a tool for push-pulling multiple surfaces as well. But let's hop over into SketchUp and take a look at the way that this works. So first off, the reason that we need joint push-pull is if you've ever had a curved surface like this one, and I'm going to go ahead and toggle my hidden geometry off. If you've ever tried to push-pull a curved surface, you're probably familiar with this message right here: cannot push-pull curved or smooth surfaces. And so for simple modeling, that's not really a big deal, but for more complex modeling, a lot of the time you do want to add thickness to more complex surfaces. That's where joint push-pull comes in. So one other thing to note really quick is when you do install one of Fredo 6's extensions, you also need to make sure that you've downloaded LibFredo and installed that as well. So LibFredo is basically just Fredo 6's library of different things that his extensions reference. You're going to need that or you're going to get an error message. That one you can download for free. You don't need to pay for that one. And so from this page right here, note that there is a documentation tab. However, this link doesn't really work for me. However, if you go into the forum post about joint push-pull interactive, which I can link to down below, there's a link in here to the documentation, which is right here. So you can click on this link right here in order to view the newest version of the documentation. Note that this is a little bit outdated, but it gives you an idea of what the tools do. They haven't really changed that much since this was written. Joint push-pull by going to Fredo 6 joint push-pull right here. And so note that there's an option over here for a quick launcher that you can click on in order to access different tools from here. You can toggle those on and off in the toolbar if you want to. Like for example, I don't usually use the extrude push-pull or follow push-pull that much. So if I didn't want to do that, then I could go ahead and toggle those off. And there's some settings in here. There's a super interesting one we're going to talk about at the end of the video. So make sure you stick around for that. And so in general, the point of joint push-pull is you can use it in order to extrude curved surfaces, right? So if I use the joint push-pull function in here like this, it's going to allow you to push-pull that curved surface. And so fundamentally, just so you have an understanding of this, the reason why you need an extension for this is the way that SketchUp displays surfaces like this one is actually making up a curved surface by smoothing a bunch of flat surfaces. So if you go into your hidden geometry like this, notice how this surface isn't actually curved, it's a bunch of singular surfaces. Well, if we were to come in here and push-pull these, right, like this, so say I was to just come in here and push-pull a bunch of these surfaces, notice the problem is because they're all individual faces, they push-pull out and they don't really merge together. So what joint push-pull does is it sets this up where it does that automatic merging of those surfaces so that they do become just a simple push-pulled surface like this. Now, the first option is the thickener. All the thickener is it's just a tool designed to allow you to thicken a surface in SketchUp. So it's supposed to be like the simplest way to do this, right? It's just basically a push-pull tool that just thickens a surface is all that it does. So notice how it's creating new surfaces right here. I don't use this one very much because a lot of the time I need to customize the way that the tool is going to work. So probably the tool that I use the most, depending on what I'm trying to do, is this first option, this blue option, which is just the simple joint push-pull. So when you click on the joint push pull right here, notice how it's going to pop up a menu that looks like this. For you, it might start off looking like this. There's a 3 arrow thing that you can click on in order to get additional options. I pretty much always have that maximized, not minimized. And so there's a few different face selection options in here. I usually just leave this on surface. I don't really want this on all connected faces, because if I do all connected faces, notice how it's mousing or selecting everything, and it's going to push pull everything, which is not what I want. What I want instead is just to be able to do an individual surface like this. And so when you activate this tool, notice how there's an option in here to, when you click on a surface, you can single click and move your mouse, and you can type in an offset. Or if you decide that you don't like the offset that you selected, right? If I typed in 4 inches right here, I didn't like that, I could adjust this to like 2 inches, and notice how that's going to change on my screen. Now, a couple other interesting things about this. First off, the finishing. So what the finishing is going to do is it's going to set if it thickens this. This is a lot like tapping the control key with the regular push-pull tool. If I was to activate the thicken function, notice how what it's going to do is it's going to thicken this surface, rather than over here it's just going to push-pull it, meaning it's going to push-pull that face out. If you use the thicken option, notice how it's going to create a new face from your starting point every time that you do this, just like this. So from that standpoint, knowing the difference there can actually be extremely valuable. We're not going to worry too much about the plane on this one. We'll worry about that a little bit later. Now, you do also have other options in here for things like molding. And so if we play with the molding, right, notice what that's going to do is that's going to have this kind of like not only... That's going to have this surface not only be push-pulled out, but also be push-pulled at kind of an angle like this. So if you want this to be more of an angular result, you can adjust the molding right here. So again, I don't use that too much with the regular joint push-pull, but there's another tool we're going to use a little bit later where that's a big deal. So borders, what borders is going to do is there's 3 options in here, right? The first is none. And so if I set my borders to none, notice what that's going to do is that's just going to extrude the surface, but it's not actually going to include the interior geometry in here, like this. If you set your borders to contour, what it's going to do is it's going to do kind of a typical joint push-pull, right? In the sense that it's going to basically have faces in here, and it's going to have kind of a perimeter frame around the outside of the extrusion like this. Now, if you select the option for grid, notice what that's going to do is that's going to create that new geometry for every one of these right here. And so if we toggle X-ray mode on, notice what that's doing is that's literally extruding like every edge in here like this. Now that can be kind of interesting if you use it for things like this surface right here, right? Because if I use joint push-pull right here and I extrude it to a grid like this, and say that we were to activate the molding like this. So we'll do a little bit of molding right here. Well, if I was to then select this surface, and I'm just going to right click and I'm going to use selection toys to select only the faces and delete them, notice how this created a full grid in here, which you could then use in order to create like structural members or something like that. So you can actually use that grid function in order to create edges in here as well. And so then we've also got the option in here to generate your surface as a group. So I'm going to toggle my molding off right here. But if you were to do that, what that's going to do is that's going to generate a surface, but it's going to, and we don't want this to be a contour, or we don't want this to be a grid, we want it to be a contour. But notice what it does is it doesn't affect your original surface. What it does is it creates that surface as a group instead, right here. And so one thing to note about this tool, and then I'm going to show you something cool that it can do that's super helpful for things like stairs. One thing to note about this tool is you can use it to select multiple different surfaces, right? So if I was to try to extrude this surface right here, and then this surface right here, you could do it, but notice how it leaves you with this gap that you would have to manually fix. Well, with joint push-pull, you can do a shift click to select. You can activate the tool, and I'm going to toggle this generate as group off. Well, notice how what that's going to do is that is going to generate the surface by kind of stitching these surfaces together just like this. So if you want to push-pull multiple different surfaces, you can do that using this tool. So an interesting function here might be if we go into hidden geometry mode and say you only wanted to push-pull a couple of the surfaces like this, you could select all of those, and note that you can use this in order to push-pull multiple different surfaces at once. Now, one function that a lot of people don't know about within this tool is the progressive push-pull function. And so what that means is that if you activate this tool and you set an offset, right? So I'm going to offset this face right here. So I'm going to deselect everything before I do that, but I'm going to offset this up by maybe like 2 inches or something like that. Well, notice how now if I tap the Alt key and then click, what that's going to do is that's going to put me in progressive push-pull mode. And so what that means is that it's going to take that surface and it's going to push pull it the amount that it push pulled the last one, but then it's going to multiply that by 2. So this one got push pulled twice as much as this one gets push pulled 3 times as much as this one, and so it allows you to really quickly create things like stairs. So next up we've got a tool that I don't really use all that much. It's the round push pull, and so I prefer using Fredo 6's Fredo corner tool in order to do this instead. But basically what it does is it push pulls surfaces and then rounds them. So for round push pull, for example, if I select these surfaces, then extrude this out, notice what it's doing is on these external corners, it's creating this kind of like curve right here. And notice how I set this in order to be placed in a group like this, just so I can kind of move this off to the side so that we can see the different results in here. But that's basically what this tool is good for, is it's good for creating those curves on those external faces like this. So say we were to select all of these right here, and I probably want to draw a line across this one. But say that we were to select all of these right here, that round push-pull is going to round off all those exterior corners. And then there's things you can adjust in here, like for example, you can set the angle at which it's going to create the rounding, as well as you can set the number of segments that are in here for the rounding. So you can kind of see this right here. If I go into the hidden geometry, you can see it a little better, but that's going to adjust the number of segments that are created. Now, I don't really use this one all that much. I prefer using like a Fredo corner or something like that, mostly because you get a little bit more control over the joints that are created, but it is in here. And so next up, we have a tool that's really interesting to me that you can do some really cool stuff with, and that's the vector push-pull. And so up to this point, what we've been doing, right, is we've been using joint push-pull, and this push-pulls all of the surfaces based on the surface direction, right? And then it creates a surface like this. And so what that does is that allows you to select different things and push-pull them in a certain direction. So say, for example, that I was to select just a bunch of the faces on this side right here. Notice how instead of push-pulling them out, I can set if it goes on the Z, X, or Y direction like this. And you can tap the arrow keys in order to do that. But notice how I can take all of them, and instead of just thickening those, I can push-pull them or extrude them in a direction like this. Now where this gets interesting is you also have the ability in here, and I'm going to go to a parallel projection mode, but you also have the ability in here to flatten those. And so I really like that function, because if you click on this option right here, it's only going to show up if you click the right arrow, but if you click on the flatten, what that's going to do, and we're going to tap the right arrow key right here, is it's going to flatten that geometry in a certain direction, right? It extrudes it out and then it makes it flat. Well, in this case, obviously we've got a bunch of like additional geometry in here, which you could then erase out, right? So this all appears to be selected, so I can just hit the delete key. But that lets you take certain things and push-pull them in a direction. Now that's really interesting for creating solids of surfaces, right? So if I have like terrains or something like that, I use this a lot in the Z direction in order to create a surface. Notice how you probably want this to be in the thicken mode right here, so it keeps the original face. But notice how I can extrude this down, and now what I've done is I've created a solid group in here that I can then like slice or do a lot of different things with. So I use this to create solids like this a lot of the time in SketchUp, and it's super powerful. Now, one thing to note about that is for a surface like this one, if you don't want to flatten it, what you can do is you can just leave it like this, and you can thicken it, right? And so when you thicken it, what that's going to do is that's going to make the surface thicker, but you can dictate that it goes straight up and down. So like, for example, if you were to try to do this, and I'm going to toggle my hidden geometry off, but if you were to try to do this with the joint push-pull, what happens is it'll do it, but notice how you get this kind of like crazy in and out a little bit right here, because it's basically push-pulling based on all the face directions. So this, for example, and I probably want to set it, I'm just going to tap Control in order to put it, there we go, in the other mode right here. But this is a little bit crazier of a shape than this one because these were extruded straight up and down. So notice how it gives you a slightly better result. So anytime I want to thicken something straight up and down in a direction, I use this vector push-pull. Now, next up, we have a tool that I think is misunderstood and I actually really enjoy. It's called the normal push-pull. And so basically what that does, and you have to have a little bit of an understanding of the way that topology works in SketchUp and faces are displayed, but normal push-pull is going to push-pull individual faces based on their directions. And so there's a bunch of options in here which we'll look at in a second, but basically if we do this, right, it's kind of like extruding everything the way that we had talked about before, so all of those faces at once, but it's not healing this in right here, which can give you really interesting results. Now we've got a little bit of an overlap in here because those are more like triangulated faces, but it gives you an idea of what it's capable of. So say for example that I was to select the sphere and use normal push-pull, it's going to push-pull every one of those faces in the direction that those faces are facing, and it's not going to heal this in here. So that's really interesting if you want to select like individual faces or something like that. So say we were to pick up a few of these faces in here and use normal push-pull, notice how we can use this in order to extrude those all out in whatever direction they're facing. Now that by itself is not especially helpful, but where this is actually powerful is actually not with surfaces like this one, it's with surfaces like these. And so the reason why is, say that I wanted to create a pile of lumber in here. Well, I could use normal push-pull in order to push-pull all of those at once. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this so that it generates those as a group. But say I've got a pile of lumber right here. I'm just going to push-pull this to 8 feet or negative 8 feet. I didn't like that. Okay. Negative 8 feet. There we go. Like that. Well, what that's going to do is that's going to extrude every one of these. And if you were to select the option for borders grid like this, notice how if I go into X-ray mode, this actually extrudes every single one of these as an individual, not as an individual object, but it keeps all of that geometry in here. Now, the only downside to this, and something you might do with components or something like that, the only downside to this is it generates them all as a bunch of raw geometry in a group, so it doesn't generate the individual boards, but it's not really that big of a deal for what we're trying to do right here. But then another cool thing about this is this function also has some things people don't know about, which is randomization, tapering, and molding. We're not going to worry too much about molding, but say that I was to take these surfaces right here and push-pull them, well, that's not very interesting. But if I was to toggle my X-ray mode off and toggle randomization on, you can set randomization of the extrusions like this. So you could use this to create like random board faces and other things like that. Now there's a little bit of geometry in here that you'd have to clean up, but being able to randomly extrude a bunch of things at once is actually super valuable. Now, one other thing that people don't really think about with this, and you wouldn't always do this, but say that you had like a tile wall. So I'm just going to extrude this by a little bit. In this case, we don't want to randomize it, right? So if we were to extrude a tile wall out by, call it 1/8 of an inch, well, that's actually not super interesting, right? Because there's no gaps in here. But there's an option in here for tapering. And so if you set tapering, what you can do is you can set every object in here so that it tapers by a little bit. So in this case, if I type in 0.95 right here, I could use this in order to really quickly taper all of these different surfaces in here like this in order to create like individual tiles or something like that. So if you were taking this to a rendering program and you needed gaps in here, this is a great way to do that. Okay, and so these next two tools I very rarely use. I don't think I've ever actually used the follow push pull tool. So the extrude push pull tool kind of makes sense for one kind of application, which is if you joint push pull a surface like this one. So I'm just going to joint push pull this out. Notice how you get kind of an odd result in the sense that everything is kind of like non-uniform, and it creates distortion to the object, right? You can kind of see that distortion right here for this object on this surface. Well, you can use this function in order to do that a little more cleanly. So notice how this one, for example, it maintains kind of the same orientation that's over here. So this one gets a little bit more distorted. You can kind of see that. It's kind of like just in a weird direction, while this one is a lot more uniform in the way that it creates that geometry. Now, you can use this one to do things like flatten the surfaces as well, which is kind of interesting, but this is what I use this one for. Honestly, I do not understand what the follow push pull tool is for. So my understanding is that it's guided by the outside bordering faces. So if you ever have something like this piece right here that's cut off and has a taper to it, what it's doing is it's push pulling this face out, but it kind of continues the taper right here. I've never really actually used this for anything. If I ever do, I'll do like a standalone video on it, but it is an interesting function. All right, so that's kind of an overview of joint push pull. If you have any specific questions or use cases, I'd love to hear about them in the comments down below. If you do want to find out more about SketchUp extensions, you can check out my free SketchUp extensions guide, which gives you an idea of where everything is, as well as links to tutorials on how to use all of those different extensions. You can check that out at TheSketchUpEssentials.com/extensions. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.